Russian tanks are not always destroyed by powerful strikes at the front line. In many cases, they fall into chaos the moment they move through mined areas. It is not a massive explosion that wipes out the entire formation. It is a small disruption that begins when one vehicle slows down or stops in the wrong position, and then spreads through every vehicle behind it. When that happens, the problem is no longer about firepower or armor. It is about whether the formation can still maintain control of its own movement. And once that control is lost, what follows is no longer a true assault in the traditional sense. So why are Russian mechanized units repeatedly being pushed into areas where mines can trigger this kind of chain reaction? What makes these approach routes so narrow that a single blockage can throw the entire formation into chaos? And from the very beginning, what is really happening on the paths these tanks are forced to take? Stay with Military Force to find out. Russian mechanized assaults often begin with a weakness that appears long before direct contact with Ukrainian defenders. The problem is often built into the route itself. Tanks, APCs, and IFVs are regularly pushed through narrow approach lanes where one side is bordered by tree lines, trenches, embankments, or broken ground, while the other side is blocked by buildings, rubble, fencing, or terrain that limits lateral movement. Once a column enters that kind of space, its choices begin to shrink quickly. In open terrain, armored units can spread out, increase spacing, and adjust direction when danger appears ahead. In a restricted corridor, that flexibility disappears. Vehicles must follow the same path, often at short distance from one another, and each crew becomes tied to the movement of the vehicle in front. If the lead element slows, hesitates, or meets resistance, the rest of the formation is pulled into the same problem almost immediately. That makes the entire column easier to predict and far harder to reorganize under pressure. The route stops serving as a road to attack and starts acting like a channel that removes options before the real engagement has even started. By the time the crews recognize that problem, their room to correct it is already dangerously small. This is why these routes no longer work as classic breakthrough lanes. They now function more like channels of exposure. Ukrainian forces do not need to search a broad area for targets because the terrain has already compressed the assault into a narrow and predictable track. A formation moving through such a space is not only advancing toward the front, it is also moving deeper into a zone where every meter can be observed and prepared for in advance. That changes the value of armor and numbers. A tank is most effective when it can choose angles, use the ground well, and avoid being fixed on one line of movement. An APC or IFV is more survivable when it has room to disperse and unload troops under better conditions. In these corridors, much of that freedom disappears. Protected vehicles still matter, but they cannot fully offset the loss of maneuver. Larger formations still carry weight, but they become less useful when many vehicles are pushed into the same strip of land. The result is that what looks from a distance like a powerful armored push may contain a hidden weakness. And once a column is compressed into a route with almost no room to escape, the next phase of the battle is shaped less by speed than by where the first blocking point appears. A mine does not need to destroy an entire armored column to decide the fate of an assault. It only needs to stop one vehicle in the right place at the right time. That is what makes mines so dangerous inside narrow approach corridors. Their most important effect is often not raw destruction, but interruption. A single blast under a lead tank or a vehicle in the middle of the formation can break the rhythm of the whole column in seconds. Once that happens, the problem is no longer limited to one crew or one damaged machine. It spreads backward through every vehicle that was depending on forward movement to stay organized. In these circumstances, the mine acts less like an isolated weapon and more like a trigger that exposes the weakness of the entire route. In a confined lane, the vehicles behind the first blocked point do not have many good options. Some must brake hard. Some try to reverse. Some attempt to edge toward the side, even when the ground there may be soft, mined, or blocked by obstacles. Each reaction creates new pressure on the vehicles behind it. Distances shrink quickly. Angles disappear. Drivers lose the space they need to maneuver safely. What had looked like a moving assault begins to resemble a traffic trap under combat conditions. The damage is therefore physical and procedural at the same time. A single disabled vehicle becomes the reason an entire formation starts losing shape, speed, and control. Even those vehicles that remain mechanically intact are pulled into the same problem, because their freedom of movement now depends on a route that has already begun to fail. This matters because armored warfare depends heavily on tempo and spacing. Crews need room to read the ground, follow commands, and react without colliding with friendly vehicles or exposing weak positions. A mine strike cuts through that process immediately. The crews behind often do not know whether the vehicle ahead has hit a mine, been struck by fire, or suffered a mechanical failure. Yet they must still act at once. That confusion is dangerous in any battle, but it is especially dangerous in a narrow corridor where even a correct choice may be impossible to carry out. Dust, smoke, engine noise, damaged optics, and radio pressure make the situation worse. The formation may still look mostly intact from a distance, but inside the column, awareness has already begun to break down. Commanders lose a clear picture of the lane ahead, while drivers and gunners are forced to operate in a space where time is short and visibility is poor. That is why a well-placed minefield does more than damage armor. It creates hesitation, and hesitation in a compressed route can be as dangerous as direct fire. Once the column is forced to stop, the assault no longer controls the pace of the engagement. It begins reacting to a problem that grows with every second of delay. The route changes function. It is no longer a path of advance. It becomes a holding area under pressure, where vehicles remain exposed, crowded, and unable to restore order quickly. At that point, the deeper purpose of the blocking point becomes clear. It has not simply destroyed a vehicle. It has fixed the rest of the formation in place and stripped it of initiative. And when the column has already been reduced to a clustered line on the same axis, the hardest part of Ukraine's job is nearly finished, because every layer of fire waiting behind can now operate against a target set that is already trapped. What began as movement toward the front has become a delayed and compressed target array that invites the next phase of attack. From there, the engagement becomes easier to shape and harder to escape. Once Russian vehicles have been forced onto the same narrow axis, Ukraine no longer needs to treat them as separate targets. At that moment, artillery becomes the most effective tool for turning a blocked column into a broader zone of damage. A congested route creates target density, and target density is exactly what indirect fire is built to punish. Instead of chasing one moving vehicle after another, Ukrainian gunners can strike the whole cluster and let blast pressure, fragments, and shock spread through several vehicles at once. This changes the engagement very quickly. The assault is no longer dealing with one interruption at the front. It is now facing damage that spreads across the formation faster than crews can restore order. What began as a traffic problem under combat conditions starts becoming a battlefield collapse. This is especially dangerous for armored personnel carriers, infantry fighting vehicles, ammunition carriers, and damaged vehicles that are already stuck in place. These platforms are often the most vulnerable to secondary effects. If artillery lands near them, fire can spread quickly, stored ammunition can ignite, and nearby vehicles can be hit by fragments or blast from the first explosion. A strike that appears limited at the point of impact can therefore produce much wider consequences. One burning vehicle may block even more of the route. One exploding ammunition load may damage another machine that had not yet been directly hit. Crews may open hatches, abandon cover, or lose contact with nearby units. In that environment, artillery does more than destroy equipment. It magnifies the disorder that was already growing inside the column. Timing is what makes this layer of fire so important. If shells arrive just after the route has been blocked, they hit the formation at the moment when vehicles are closest together and least able to move. That means the same strike can damage several targets, increase confusion, and delay any attempt to recover the lane. Even vehicles that survive physically may lose their usefulness in practice. Optics can be damaged, tracks can be broken, engines can fail. Commanders may no longer know whether to wait, reverse, or continue forward. Different crews start reacting in different ways, which makes the formation harder to control as a single force. Some vehicles try to hold position, others attempt to pull back. Others remain in place because there is simply nowhere safe to go. Artillery widens these fractures and prevents the assault from restoring a shared rhythm. That is why artillery remains valuable even after the first barrage. Vehicles already damaged by mines, stalled by congestion, or weakened by earlier contact can be struck again before recovery crews or supporting elements can stabilize the situation. Repeated shelling keeps the route unstable and keeps the crews under pressure. A force that is damaged but still organized can remain dangerous. A force that is damaged, scattered, and repeatedly hit becomes far less capable of continuing the attack. This is the deeper role of artillery in this kind of battle. It does not need to destroy every vehicle by itself. Its job is to expand the damage, deepen the confusion, and strip the column of the cohesion it needs to survive. It turns stalled armor into an exposed and diminishing target set that grows steadily weaker with every passing minute. But even that is only part of the process, because once artillery has accelerated the breakdown, Ukraine still needs a weapon that can hunt the surviving vehicles one by one with greater precision and persistence. Once a Russian assault column has been slowed, compressed, and partially damaged, drones become the weapon that shifts the battle from disruption to elimination. This is the point where the fight stops being mainly about blocking movement and starts becoming a process of removing vehicles one after another. FPV drones and loitering strike drones appear when the formation is already struggling to recover order. That timing matters because vehicles under pressure are easier to track. A tank that is moving slowly, pausing, or trying to reverse inside a damaged column presents a clearer and more predictable target than one advancing freely across open ground. In this phase, Ukrainian operators do not need to destroy everything at once. They only need to identify which vehicles still matter most and attack them in sequence. That change in method gives Ukraine an advantage, because the battle is no longer decided by one large strike, but by smaller hits that steadily remove the column's strength. That is why armored personnel carriers, infantry fighting vehicles carrying troops, and ammunition vehicles become especially important targets. A successful strike on one of these machines can do more than disable a piece of equipment. It can ignite fuel, trigger stored rounds, injure nearby soldiers, and add fresh panic to a route that is already under stress. The effect spreads beyond the point of impact. It can interrupt recovery attempts, block rescue efforts, and make nearby crews more hesitant at the exact moment when quick decisions are needed. Another important point is that drones do not need immediate destruction to be effective. A vehicle that loses mobility may still have armor and weapons, but its value drops sharply once it cannot move out of danger. A disabled vehicle on the same axis becomes a fixed target for the next strike and a growing liability for everyone behind it. It may obstruct movement, expose soldiers trying to leave the vehicle, and force the crews nearby to make risky choices about whether to wait, turn back, or remain in place. This is where drones differ from artillery in a critical way. Artillery punishes the cluster. Drones pursue the survivor. They can follow one vehicle, approach from a useful angle, search for weaker points, and return if the first hit does not finish the job. That persistence is what makes drones central at this stage of the battle. The surviving Russian vehicles are no longer facing only general battlefield pressure. They are facing a form of attack that is focused, selective, and repeated. Each machine can be watched, tested, struck, and revisited until it is no longer useful. That changes the psychology of the battlefield. Crews are not simply under threat from distant fire. They are under threat from something that can appear directly above their vehicle and punish hesitation. For Ukraine, this makes drones more than a supporting tool. They become the main instrument for clearing the remaining vehicles from the route. This is also why the assault loses coherence so quickly, because each surviving machine begins to fight its own isolated battle instead of acting as part of one organized push. Yet even those that survive are not moving towards safety. If they continue forward, they enter a denser defensive belt waiting ahead. At first glance, reaching the Ukrainian line should give an attacking force its best chance to recover momentum. But on today's battlefield, that assumption is no longer dependable. For Russian assault groups that have already taken losses on the approach, moving closer often makes the situation more dangerous rather than less. A formation that reaches the line after losing order does not arrive with full strength. It arrives weakened, compressed, and harder to control. Some vehicles are damaged. Some troops have already dismounted under pressure. Some crews are still trying to decide whether to push forward or hold position. That means the assault no longer appears as one coordinated wave. It reaches the defense in broken pieces. And once those pieces move into close range, they become easier for Ukrainian defenders to identify, isolate, and engage. The closer the surviving elements get, the more clearly their earlier damage begins to show. What looked like persistence now starts to look like exposure. This is where the local defensive layer becomes decisive. Ukrainian infantry hidden in tree lines, trench networks, and prepared positions do not need to search a wide area for targets. The remaining Russian vehicles are moving directly toward them. Dismounted soldiers trying to find cover appear in short and vulnerable moments. Vehicles that attempt to continue forward expose themselves to anti-armor weapons, direct fire, and observation from positions chosen in advance. The battlefield at this distance no longer rewards forward pressure on its own. It rewards preparation, concealment, and timing. That changes the meaning of proximity. In earlier armored warfare, getting closer could restore initiative and shorten the defender's time to respond. Now, close distance often favors the side that has already organized a layered defense in that exact zone. A damaged assault force entering this belt is not necessarily approaching a breakthrough. It is entering the area where every remaining weakness becomes easier to exploit. That is why close contact no longer guarantees opportunity. It can instead become the most lethal stage of the assault. A stalled vehicle near the line is more dangerous to its own side because it blocks movement where space is already limited. A scattered infantry group becomes more vulnerable because it must cross ground already watched and covered by supporting fire. The surviving Russian elements may still hope that one last push can rescue the attack. But the defensive line ahead is not an empty space waiting to be crossed. It is the inner layer of a system that has already absorbed the assault and is now ready to finish it at short range. The force may have survived mines, artillery, and drones, yet it still has not escaped the wider defensive structure around the line. It has only reached the point where concealment is weaker, movement is harder, and the defender's local advantage is strongest. And once an assault begins to fall apart just outside the Ukrainian position, the logic of the battle changes again, because Ukraine no longer has reason to stop at blocking the attack when counterattacks and pursuit become more effective. Once the Russian assault begins to break apart, the battle changes character. Ukraine is no longer concerned only with stopping the attack at the point of contact. It moves quickly to ensure that the surviving elements cannot recover, regroup, or withdraw in an organized way. That transition matters because a damaged assault force can still remain dangerous if it is given time to rebuild control. Scattered infantry can regroup. Crews can abandon disabled vehicles and join other units. Damaged armor can sometimes be recovered later if the area is not kept under pressure. Ukraine's response is built around denying that second chance. Instead of treating the collapse of the attack as the end of the engagement, it treats it as the moment to press harder. This is where tanks and BTR-4E vehicles enter the picture. They are used against the remains of the Russian formation, especially damaged vehicles, dismounted infantry, and improvised shelter positions near the route of advance. The battlefield they enter is filled with stalled armor, broken movement, exposed soldiers, and fragmented resistance. That gives Ukrainian forces a chance to strike opponents who still have weapons, but no longer have cohesion. This follow-up phase matters because survival is not the same as recovery. A vehicle that is merely damaged may still be evacuated or repaired later. A group of soldiers that escapes the first wave of fire may still hold ground, protect equipment, or delay Ukrainian movement if left alone. For that reason, the final stage of the engagement is treated as part of the same battle, not as a separate event. Artillery can strike vehicles that remain on the route. Drones can return to damaged machines that still show activity. Direct fire can finish targets exposed near the defensive line. Russian infantry who leave their vehicles to stay alive face another danger. Tree lines, buildings, and shallow shelters may hide them briefly, but those same places can become isolated pockets once Ukrainian forces begin local pursuit. The result is that the assault does not simply fail. It is steadily stripped of the ability to reorganize, withdraw cleanly, or preserve combat value for another push. Taken together, this sequence reveals more than a successful defense. It shows a combat method that links blocking, attrition, and pursuit into one continuous process. And when that full chain is visible, the larger question is no longer only how one Russian attack collapsed, but whether this layered battlefield system is changing what armored offensives can still accomplish. What this pattern reveals is larger than the loss of a few Russian vehicles on one road. It shows that modern armored warfare is being challenged by systems that connect terrain, timing, surveillance, and layered fire into one continuous defensive method. In that environment, the key question is no longer whether a tank has thick armor or whether a column has enough vehicles to keep moving. The real question is whether that force can preserve order long enough to survive a chain of disruption that begins before direct contact and continues until retreat becomes difficult. That is why these failed assaults matter. They point to a battlefield where breakthrough is harder, exposure is constant, and recovery is no longer guaranteed once momentum is lost. If this trend continues, the traditional logic of mechanized assault will face growing pressure, because the side that controls the sequence of detection, delay, and destruction may now control the battle itself. War is not only about weapons and tactics, but about the long-lasting cost carried by people and societies. Understanding how these battles unfold helps explain why peace is difficult to build and even harder to protect. If this analysis was useful, follow Military Force for more clear insights into modern warfare and why it should always be avoided when possible.